Hi, we return to 2 Samuel 13 after Amnon has horribly raped his sister Tamar and now does even worse by throwing her out. And as I posted in a comment on YouTube, I know these videos are difficult to watch and to explore because of the horrible violence that we see here. But if you can stick with them, I think the text is revealing a lot about the nature of that violence and really undermining David's monarchy, not just because David is being punished because of the Bathsheba incident, but showing that the entire pattern of monarchy inevitably leads to this kind of behavior. Some of that is subtle and some of that is even speculative, but I think if you stick with this, we can hear multiple layers of what's going on, with the original audience uncomfortable with what was going on in the time of David and after. So as you can see on the right side of the screen are a series of questions that I went over in the introductory video to these two chapters of 2 Samuel 13 and 14. I really encourage you to watch those to get a sense of how it all fits together, although none of these are specifically addressed to our scene today. But I've also gone over how our chapters 13 and 14 fit with the earlier chapters 11 and 12 as a set of three stories of women that are sexually engaged with David or with his family in a way that reveals a lot about monarchy. And these are posted, as always, at radicalbible.net. In addition, we went over these parallels between the two chapters themselves, not least of which is the setup, which is very unusual, of a couple of people talking with one of them having been given words by a third person that is deceptive speech. And in this case, they both involve an aftermath of Absalom, which we'll see when the scene shifts after this immediate scene here. We've also been looking at the key words in the shape here, and as I've gone back and shown this chiasm from Fackelman that takes up the whole first unit of the story up till verse 23 here, 22, and then the next part, and 22 to 39 is here with Absalom and the follow-up. But I had noted yesterday in the last video that some of the elements that were in the translation I had here were not accurate, so I actually have changed that here and reposted it. So if you downloaded an earlier version of this, this is now the current version, and what I was showing the last video up here has been changed a little bit, but it's fitting for where we're going to be at today. And so we've been on this part, and we went to the first part of this up to here, up to the rape itself, and now we're going to look at the second half of this. And you can easily see the chiastic parallels both in Tamar's statement about what Amnon is doing is wrong and it makes him a fool, or here it's described specifically as evil, but in both cases he would not listen to her here and he would not listen to her here. And so, as we'll see, the story at one level is about the immediate characters, but Amnon is also perhaps a Saulite. His mother, Ahinoam, is the same name as Saul's wife, and although the text never says that David took Ahinoam from Saul, we certainly know he took Abigail from Nabal, and he took Michal back from... We know that David is willing to take women from their men, and this may well be a similar sort of situation here. They're also in the sense of Ahinoam from Saul being the mother of Amnon, and Amnon being a Saulite. And so one of the possibilities I've been noting the last couple of videos is maybe David's passivity here is his acknowledgement at one level that he wants Amnon and later Absalom to die so Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, can become king. Some of that is speculative, but as we go through these chapters and as we get up to the time when Nathan will tell Bathsheba, didn't David promise to put your son on the throne, we can wonder whether that's propaganda because David is old and feeble and doesn't understand what's going on, or whether that was really the plan all along, and these chapters are setting that up by suggesting that the rape is what is the excuse for getting rid of Amnon. And plainly the characterization of Amnon is wholly negative, although the first verses I was noting suggest he loves her and he's lovesick about her, and it could have been positive. It obviously went the other direction. We realize that he had that violence in him all along, and it's expressed further here. So to the extent that Amnon is a Saulite, it perhaps is expressing the dead-end nature of that lineage, but to the extent that he's also a son of David that is not David's plan for the succession for whatever reason, maybe David is allowing him to be in this situation where Absalom will be the one to dispatch Amnon, and then later Joab and his men will be the one to dispatch Absalom. That's all a little bit of speculation, but the text upholds some of that, and of course it's speculation because the text doesn't tell us David's motivations and leaves it for readers to discern for themselves. So let's start in with the second half of verse 15, which is translated terribly here, as so often here in the New RSV. And I'll make it bigger here so you can see it more clearly, and the expression, because the suggestion in RSV that he was seized is saying that something else from outside is seizing him, and that's not the case at all. So let's look at the Hebrew that we see over here. And Amnon hated her with a great and powerful hatred, because the great hatred with which he hated her was more than the love with which he had loved her. That's quite a sentence. And hate, both in noun and verb form, is 4 times there. A great and powerful hatred. We have to consider just for a moment what the words hatred and love mean in Hebrew. They're very different than what they made in English. The English word love can cover a wide range of views, from inanimate objects, I love pizza, or abstractions like I love my favorite sports team or my nation and things like that, but more concrete things like my wife or my son or other relatives. And so it's not a good word for comparison, really, because the Hebrew word, as well as in Greek and other biblical texts, means something very different. In this case, the pair basically speaks of being drawn to or repelled by people. It's not so much emotional, it certainly carries that, but it's the sense of love as being very much drawn to somebody, and we saw that Amnon was drawn. We might distinguish love from lust and use love to talk about a selfless draw, as opposed to lust as a more selfish, seeing the person as an object, what plainly he does here. When he sends her out, he won't even use a female pronoun. He'll just simply send this thing out. And hate as the opposite of that, not something that we might think of, I hate you, and grip my teeth and want to yell at you, although it could be that, but simply repulsion. And so what we're going to see here is that something is going on inside Amnon that Tamar is the expression of. He was drawn to her to the extent that it made him lovesick, and now that he's gotten what he wanted, he wants no more of her, and doesn't even want to see her. So it's a horrible scene, but Tamar will not be silenced easily, and we'll see how she, unlike Dinah in Genesis 34, will make her voice heard, at least within the text and also outside the text, as we can see. After he hated her, he tells her, get out. And we see that's parallel in the Hebrew, you can see below, kumi lekai, parallel to kumi wena leka, and as Polza notes in Judges 19:28. Let's look at that there. And this is the man whose concubine was raped, and he says when she's lying dead on the doorstep, get up, we are going, but there was no answer. So there he's speaking to a dead woman to get up, and here Amnon speaking to a woman who's socially dead and just telling her to get out. But again, she's not to be silenced. So she said to him, no, my brother, really emphasizing that here, not calling him by name, but highlighting that he's her brother. For this wrong, or better, this evil in sending him away is greater than the other you did. So now we hear that she describing after the fact what he did earlier as evil, and certainly we would agree that that kind of forceful rape is about as pure evil as you can get in dominating another person like that. But the greater evil is because now that she's been raped, and even if it wasn't rape, now that she's been sexually entered, she's no longer available for any other man and would end up spending the rest of her life in her father's house. And so her whole life would be ruined here. And that's what she's protesting against. She had said that if you'd asked our father, he would have given me to you, but he refused to do that, and now it's too late for that. And so she's simply naming that this is a terrible evil, and the word for greater here is echoing the description of his hatred as evil. But he would simply not listen to her, as I noted, framing with verse 14 here, and perhaps framing all the way through the monarchy story with the Israelites not listening back in 1 Samuel 8-10 to the words of Yahweh via Samuel, being told the king will take, but they wouldn't listen. They were determined to have a king over them. As I noted last time, if the king's daughter is not safe from violence from men in her own house, then who is safe among the Israelites and Judahites? In other words, monarchy has not made the people any safer in their own homes, even in their own hometown, let alone from people like the Philistines. So it continues here with and my note below from Westbrook is saying what I just said. So it continues with Amnon giving orders. He called the young man who served him, and this is the first time we're hearing of this. We'd heard about sending away the men who were in the room, and we didn't know who they were. We had to assume that as a prince he has someone to take care of his basic needs, and yet his father, the king, did not seem to hesitate in responding to Amnon's demand that he send Tamar to give him food because he was sick. Why couldn't this young man feed him? Presumably that's who feeds him all along. So that's one of the reasons I question David must have been suspicious of this, and he does nothing, that he perhaps is allowing this to take place. And we'll see Tamar's responses in verse 19 reinforce that possibility. So as my note below has, the devil designation boy and servant here, the young man who served him, serves to heighten Tamar's humiliation. The daughter of a king is to be expelled by someone who's only a boy and a mere servant. And as my note further has, finally explained the usual source of food, but also begging why David didn't wonder why this young man couldn't care for ill Amnon, as I was saying. So it's not even woman here. Send it, please. So he speaks politely to the servant, but speaks of her as an object. And as Westbrook adds here, he does not say, send this woman away. The word woman is not present in the Hebrew text. If any word should be added for clarification of translation, it should be rendered, send this thing away. And following Westbrook, that's what I did over here. And then also bolt the door after her. How rude is that, just to suggest that she's going to come in after. It makes me think of Michael Corleone closing the door on his wife at the end of Godfather 2. But perhaps that's not quite the story here. That's certainly not a rape scene. But it's certainly saying she's to be excluded, no longer part of his life. The word for bolt the door, we see it again in the response here, and it's only otherwise in Judges. We won't look back at that passage specifically. It's ironically connected to Song of Songs, which you can look at here, that in a love story, he's described, the man is describing his sister, my bride, as a locked garden, not available sexually to him. And now Amnon is sending her out and bolting the door after her. And then the narrator adds an interesting detail that's been held back to this point. Again, as my note below has, the mention of the robe and its symbolism highlights the humiliation of the king's no longer virgin daughter being thrown out bodily by a servant. The long robe with sleeves, the ketuneth pasim, is exactly what Jacob gave Joseph. And as we've been noting, one of many connections with the stories in Genesis, in particular the Joseph stories we saw last time, and with the Mrs. Potiphar connections with the Lie with Me, and many others. So we see that here on the specific connection with Joseph. And then we listen to what the text tells us here, and it doesn't apply to Joseph, but isn't it interesting that we hear this? It's about the outfit of a virgin daughter of the king, which has led some to suggest that Joseph is wearing a woman's robe there and is looking very much like a transvestite in that situation. Does Jacob know that? But that's for a different series here. The phrase clothed in earlier times is based on changing the Hebrew text from me'el, as you can hear below, to me'olam, from of old. So the earlier times is not really part of it, and I changed it over here to be more accurately the robe that the king, virgin daughters of the king wore. And there's really no sense of earlier times in this text, because this is the first king to have a virgin daughter in this situation, other than Saul plainly had Michal, who becomes David's wife, but we didn't hear anything about an outfit there, and there were no kings before that. So the earlier times really doesn't make sense of the story. It's just simply saying this is the robe of a virgin daughter of a king that she will at moment tear. So his servant put her out here, obeying precisely, and bolted the door. Again, the narrator's words match exactly as they did to sending everyone out in verse 9. But we're not done hearing of Tamar's response. And she does a whole series of things here, so it's worth our paying close attention to all the things that she does. It says she puts ashes on her head, afer al roshah here. And the word afer for ashes is very similar to the word afar in Genesis 2:7 and 3:19, the stuff from which God makes humans, and the stuff to which the Adam will return at the end of its labor. But it's also in other places. This is a small typo there to not allow us to go to the links, but we can go to the link here, where Abraham says to Yahweh, I am dust and ashes, using both those words here. The ashes here and the dust word from which it from which it was made, although I like to prefer to translate it as topsoil. So she put ashes on her head, which is, although the phrase is only here in the Masoretic text, there are other examples of wearing ashes as expressions of mourning. Let's look ahead, just a couple of chapters ahead. So David and his men on the road, while Shimei, who's one of David's opponents, is throwing stones and flinging dust at him. So throwing dust at David, not on his own head as a sign of mourning, but it obviously is a sign of displeasure with David. And there are similar examples. And all the way at the end in Revelation, we see it here as the people throwing dust on their heads, weeping and mourning over the fall of Babylon. So plainly, even hundreds of years later in the book of Revelation, it's remembered as an expression of mourning. But then she tears the long robe that she's wearing, symbolic of her loss of virginity. And as Westbrook notes below, the tearing of the robe is not only an act of mourning, it is also an indicator of Tamar's separation from David's house. And the fact of the matter is, we'll see next time in the next verse that Absalom will take her into his house. The tearing of a robe, though, recalls what we saw back in 1 Samuel 15, 27 and 28, when Samuel turned to go away and Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe and it tore, and Samuel interprets it as Yahweh tearing the kingdom of Israel away from you. And we'll see that language of tearing the kingdom away is exactly what's used in 1 Kings 11:11 for tearing it away from Solomon. In that case, the reason is given because of the foreign wives. But we see that tearing away here is expressing the symbolism of tearing away the kingdom, and maybe it's even suggesting the tearing it away from David in advance here. But then there's another ritual which is interesting. She put her hand on her head, and most scholars completely go past that without any comment at all. But it raises a question. What is that about? Is it evidence of an established ritual? I could not find anywhere else in the Bible where people put their hands on their heads as an expression of anything. But interestingly, it's used many times in Leviticus. Let's just look at 3:2 as one example. You shall lay your hand on the head of the offering and slaughter at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And that's the use throughout Leviticus. I've been noting in the face of scholars who wanted to go to Leviticus and Deuteronomy to give us a legal basis for the kind of behaviors or not behaviors that are going on here. And I've insisted throughout that our story in 2 Samuel 13 is much older than the exilic compositions of Leviticus and the late monarchical composition of Deuteronomy under the reign of Josiah in the 620s. But the echoes are very interesting, and perhaps Leviticus is simply naming something that was already known in the time of 2 Samuel but not narrated, that the officiant is to put their hand on the head of something being offered in sacrifice. And so perhaps at one level, are we meant to hear that Tamar is being sacrificed for the future of David's reign? Which is to say, to get Amnon out of the way, that David knew that Amnon was likely to rape her, and he's willing to allow his own daughter to be raped in order to get rid of Amnon. That's a very cold description of David's motivations, but after all, he was willing to have his loyal general Uriah killed without any apparent hesitation or regret after the fact. So we know he's capable of, call it what it is, cold-blooded murder. But would he do that for his own daughter? We don't know. But Tamar apparently thinks it's possible that she's being sacrificed to preserve her father. But she's still not done, crying aloud as she went. So now she's out in the public, crying aloud with the very cry of the oppressed, the cry that we hear in Exodus 2:23 that leads Yahweh to remember the people and to call on Moses. And we see it a number of other times as the cry of people that are oppressed, and yet no one responds to Tamar. David doesn't respond to her, and even Yahweh at this point doesn't respond to her. Yahweh not being active in the story. It's as if this is what we might call a secular story, and they don't care about Yahweh at all. And that seems to be the case. They really don't care about Yahweh at all here. And Yahweh is not responding in this particular moment. So Tamar is a witness to the evils of patriarchy in a monarchical form here. And will Absalom be her protector? We'll have to see where that goes next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.